Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Kaszerman, Vice President of Government Relations at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to this special edition of IssuesWatch Live. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into several components of Governor Murphy's proposed budget for New Jersey's abbreviated 2021 fiscal year. If you have any questions at any point during the broadcast, we invite you to submit them in the questions box on your screen. I'm joined today by Richard Keevey, a distinguished executive in residence at the Rutgers School of Planning and Public Policy and a lecturer at Princeton University. Rich brings a unique perspective, having served as New Jersey's budget director and comptroller under two different governors, one from each political party. Welcome, Rich.
Glad to be here.
And I'm also joined by Dale Florio of Princeton Public Affairs Group. Dale is considered one of the top lobbyists in New Jersey, and he has worked on behalf of the NJCPA for about 20 years. Welcome, Dale.
Good to be here, Jeff.
So much has changed since we last spoke in the beginning of March about Governor Murphy's original budget proposal for New Jersey's 2021 fiscal year. The first case of COVID-19 in New Jersey was on March 4th. The governor announced the stay-at-order home on March 21st. The tax filing deadline was extended to July 15th. And in an unprecedented move, lawmakers extended the state's 2020 fiscal year by 3 months to September 30th. To continue state operations, a $7.7 billion 3-month mini budget was passed in June to hold the state over until the fiscal year 2021 budget was passed. Around that same time, the governor said that the state was looking at a $10 billion shortfall over the next 12 months. Right from the start, there was disagreement over those numbers. More sober assessments were around $6 or $7 billion. To address the huge projected shortfall, legislation was passed this summer to allow the governor to bond up to $10 billion. However, any bonding has to be approved by a legislative commission comprised of 4 leading Democrats: the Senate President, the Assembly Speaker, and the respective chairs of the Assembly and Senate budget committees. On August 25th, the governor issued a $32.4 billion budget proposal for the abbreviated 2021 fiscal year. And now the legislature and the governor have until September 30th to approve a final budget. Let's start by reviewing the broad highlights of the proposed budget, and then we'll get into some specifics. When we add the $7.7 billion mini budget to the $32.4 billion proposal, we're looking at a total budget of $40.1 billion covering July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. That's about $1.5 billion more than the fiscal 2020 budget. That's about a 3.5% hike. And it's just $830 million less than the governor's original budget proposal in February, before coronavirus struck. The budget projects a whole of $5.63 billion for October 1st to June 30th. The budget includes $4 billion in borrowing. There's $1.25 billion in cuts and savings, and there's more than $1 billion in tax hikes. Spending on public employee pension and health benefits is about $7.7 billion, which accounts for about 24% of the budget. The pension payment is $4.9 billion, and health benefits are $2.8 billion. Funding for the Homestead Benefit and Senior Freeze program is included. School funding is flat. And there's $80 million for a new program being called the Baby Bond Program, which is intended to become an annual ongoing program. And finally, there's a $2.2 billion surplus. We surveyed our members in August about what they think about the impact of the proposed budget, what its impact will be on the state's economy over the long term. 79% they felt the economy would get marginally or significantly worse. Only 11% said it would get marginally or significantly better. So let's now turn to the experts here with me today and hear what they have to say. Rich, what I see is a budget that, when we take inflation into consideration, has essentially the same spending total as the fiscal year 2020 budget, but with $4 billion in new revenues from borrowing and 1.3 billion or 1 billion, depending on who you talk to, in tax hikes, which together they are supposed to cover the projected $5.6 billion budget hole. So does that sound about right? Did I come up with a good summary from a macro perspective?
Well, I think you did, Jeff, but I want to put what you said in a different context, because I think there's a lot of things in the macro view of the budget that I would personally disagree with. The problem, as presented by the governor, is $4 billion. And that assumes $1 billion worth of taxes. But close that $4 billion, he wants to issue debt.
Rich, isn't it
If I
5.6
use,
billion?
I'm sorry?
Isn't the projected budget 5.6 billion, not 4 billion?
No, the shortfall for the bonds are $4 billion.
Oh, okay. Okay.
If recently, yesterday, the Office of Legislative Services looked at the governor's revenue estimates and concluded that they were understated by $1.3 billion. If I use the OLS revenue estimate, the problem that we're looking at is $3.7 billion, not counting any tax increases. So I would like to frame the problem that way, that the problem is $3.7 billion, assuming that the higher revenue estimates are accurate. And I think they're, based upon my review of it, it looks pretty good to me. So therefore, from my perspective, and I've written on this and I've testified before the budget committee on this, the problem does not warrant borrowing money. Borrowing money to support an operating budget, in my mind, is not the right thing to do. I asked the question, what do you do the next year to fill that gap of borrowing? So Keevey says, do not borrow and figure out how to close the $3.7 billion. And I say, cut a little more spending, maybe 2%, that'll give you $800 million. Defer paying about $2 billion of the pension system, pick it up later. Not the best thing, but better than borrowing. And if that doesn't close the whole gap, then go increase some taxes. The millionaire's tax to me doesn't bother me. It might bother somebody. But you could get $300 or $400 million there, I say do it. Increase the sales tax back up to 7%. That'll get you $700 million. There's $32 billion of tax credits and deductions in the tax code. Surely some of them aren't necessary anymore. So if you do all that, Rich says that's the way to address this problem. I digress a little bit. I was a budget director for Keevey and Florio. At the beginning of both administrations, we faced similar problems. Smaller numbers, but the problems was even greater. And those governors didn't borrow to solve the problems. They cut spending and they raised taxes, both governors Keevey and Florio. And it alleviated the problems in the future. So from a macro point of view, Jeff, that's my position. Do not borrow to support this budget. Bite the bullet, make a few more cuts. You know, there are some who argue, oh, just cut the budget. I think I haven't heard anybody say how they would do it. They just like to pontificate that it's easy to cut the budget. We can get into the later discussion of what makes up the spending. So let me stop there. I've probably spoken more than you thought I was going to speak, but that's my view.
Okay. Now that we've talked about the budget from a macro perspective, let's get into some of the details. Let's start with taxes. There's about $1 billion in tax hikes, which include expanding the highest tax rate of 10.75%, the so-called millionaires tax. That would be extended to those earning more than $1 million. Currently, it only applies to those earning over 5 million. And that is supposed to bring in about 400 million ballpark figure. There's a temporary 2.5%, I'm sorry, currently temporary 2.5 surtax on the corporation business tax for corporations with income over 1 million. That would be made permanent. It was supposed to be completely phased out by December 2021. A 5% surtax would be applied to certain federally qualified business income for individuals with income greater than 1 million. And this surtax would apply mainly to owners of pass-through businesses. There's a 60% hike in the cigarette tax from $2.7 per pack to $4.35. And there's miscellaneous other taxes like the restoration of the sales and use tax on limousine services and an assessment on HMO medical plans that would increase from 3% to 5%. Since the governor has come into the office, he's been fighting for higher taxes. Personally, I've never seen a New Jersey governor so aggressive and so proud of hiking taxes. He actually seems to me to revel in it. This year is no exception, and his tax proposals, in particular expanding the millionaires tax and creating a permanent 2.5% CBT surtax, these hikes seem particularly onerous, especially in light of the damage done to businesses and the economy by the coronavirus pandemic. In our recent survey, 64% of respondents were opposed to the expanded millionaires tax, citing that the higher tax will drive wealthy New Jerseyans and their money out of the state. Rich, I'm interested in your perspective on this. Do you think the governor's tax proposals will hurt the economy and consequently dampen state revenues?
Well, you know from my opening comments that in lieu of issuing debt and in lieu of what I would call to be draconian reductions to the budget, and we can get back to that at another time perhaps, I'm in favor of raising some taxes. I'm not sure I would agree with the mix that the governor came up with. If you remember my comments, I had no increase in the corporate tax. I thought that was not necessary, but I do go along with the 5% surtax on certain businesses, the pass-through entities. I mean, they got a very, very large savings from the federal tax code changes a couple of years ago. So from Rich's perspective, that's a good place to get some money. So Keevey says, yeah, we need some revenues. And I'm not opposed to the proposal of the millionaires tax because it is a better option than issuing debt that will only cover 1 year. And then the question is, what do you do the next year? So I'm not sure I agree with all the mix that the governor has proposed, but I would do it in the context that I suggested.
Okay. Dale, it seems to me personally that the governor's budget is trying to use the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on revenues, that he's trying to use that as an excuse to make permanent tax hikes. Is there any validity to my take on this?
Well, I think you put your finger on it, Jeff. I don't know if it was Rahm Emanuel. A lot of people have used it, former mayor of Chicago. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. And what we've seen during this period of time are, real-time efforts to help the situation. But it's also been a time for folks that have tried to get other initiatives passed that have been unsuccessful. So the millionaires tax, while this is not the first time, it's probably being taken more seriously this time. In my conversations with people, the corporate business tax, getting rid of the surtax, is probably a foregone conclusion. I think they will do that under this guise of a crisis. One of the problems that I think the governor's wrestled with, along with the legislature, and that's the federal dollars, right? We haven't really talked about that and the use of the CARES dollars, and that's always been a big variable in this mix in terms of the budget. And now there's talk of another package. I think you mentioned it at the front end of the program here, that the federal government and Mitch McConnell now are looking at some additional dollars. Now, while those dollars tend to be restricted and the state has had to abide by certain guidelines, it also creates a certain level of fungibility of other dollars that don't have to go to higher education. I think the governor did either $150 or $250 million commitment from those federal funds for higher education. Well, that's money he can then move out of his line item for higher ed in the operating budget. So that creates a real variable. So to Rich's point about, how much, you shouldn't bond. But I know the Senate budget chairman's asking that question. We don't know what we might get from the federal government. And we also see this big gap between OLS and what the governor is saying. We've got to figure out, where this is going to be best guess, because I think the legislature really wants to bond as little as possible. That's the sense that I'm getting.
Well, that's good to know. Since Governor Murphy came into office, the Senate President, Steve Sweeney, has been the key player in the legislature, pushing back against many of the governor's tax proposals, and he's been fighting to reform the state's pension and benefits system. So it was dismaying to the business community to see him immediately come out in support of the 2.5% CBT surtax. And if I recall correctly, he also said at the time he wouldn't mind if it was raised to 3%. Furthermore, he said the millionaires tax is on the table for consideration. Last year, he was opposed to it. So Dale, what's happening here? Why is the Senate president, in your opinion, so quickly embracing tax hike now? Do you think it's policy driven, politically driven, or something else?
I think it's a combination of both, Jeff. Prior to the pandemic, the governor's popularity ratings were, sub 50%. And quite frankly, a lot of that polling would say that folks really didn't know who the governor was.
Right.
As he entered the pandemic and over the course of the last 6 months, he's been a fixture in the news daily, if not every other day, through his press conferences. And by and large has gotten high marks, as high as 70% in the Monmouth poll, that he's been handling the pandemic well. When you ask the question about the economy, the numbers aren't quite the same. But legislators do look at those popularity numbers, and it adjusts the things that they're willing to try or the things that they're willing to oppose. I will say about Senator Sweeney, the Senate president, he was pretty clear when the Trump tax cuts were going through, and that was his justification for supporting the corporate surtax before. So the fact that that's continued, he's always been somebody who I thought would be supportive ultimately of removing the surtax. And Rich probably could speak to this better than me, but I don't know any tax that was supposed to sunset that ever really truly sunset. Right? They tend to do that, and then oops, we'll just kind of make it forever. I do think the millionaires tax, though, is questionable, and it will be the subject of intense debate. Again, keeping in mind the Democrats control the legislature, but that issue I don't think is a done deal, and I think it will be a subject of intense debate.
I want to very quickly mention another tax proposal.
I want to jump in there.
Go ahead, Rick. Go ahead.
I think Senator Sweeney's view has shifted. I don't disagree with any of the views that Dale has proposed or suggested there. Has shifted because of the circumstances. He issued this report, I'll be quick, Path to Progress. I happened to participate in it. And he was making significant changes in the pension systems, the health benefit systems, recommending consolidation of school districts, lots of other ones, changes that would reduce spending, because that's what he thought was necessary. I think he's now, and I don't know Senator Sweeney other than when I participated on the committee. I think he's now looking at the problem, well, I can't get those things done in the next 6 months. And therefore, I need to go and find some money. And where do you go? And that's where he's talking now, I suspect. I mean, I don't know what's in his head, but and if you agreed with my opening statement, which maybe most people didn't, we do need some taxes. And I think I agree with what Dale said. Once you put them in there, it's going to be hard to get rid of them. But it's worse if you issue debt.
Okay. Real quick, I just wanted to mention the micro tax that's been getting a lot of airplay. This tax is not in the budget, and there are a lot of questions about whether it would actually work. We won't discuss it today because of time constraints, but I did want to provide a quick overview. The micro tax, which is supported by the governor and the Senate president, they're on the same page this time, is a 1/4-cent tax on each share of stock traded in New Jersey. This tax would theoretically raise $8 billion annually because more than 10 billion shares pass through the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ daily. And a large chunk of those transactions are processed here in New Jersey in 3 major high-tech data centers. But as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of potential problems with this proposal. Probably the most concerning is that the New Jersey-based data centers that process these trades would simply leave New Jersey. Anyway, that's all I wanted to mention about this tax proposal. If it does start to move, we'll discuss it in a future episode of Issues Watch. Now let's take a look at the budget's projection of a $5.6 billion budget shortfall. Just yesterday, the New Jersey Office of Legislative Services projected a shortfall of $1.3 billion less than the governor's projection. And I think that's the biggest disparity between the governor and Office of Legislative Services that I can remember. Rich, taking into consideration that these are not normal times and that revenue projections are difficult to make right now, do you lean one way or the other as to which of these two projections is on more solid ground?
Based upon my review, and I back up a little bit on when I had written about 3 weeks ago an article on why bonding is no good, I had in that article revised the governor's revenue estimates upwards. So I basically see where the Office of Legislative Services has come from. The economy in New Jersey is a lot better than now than it was proposed by the governor back 4 months ago and only a month ago. So I'm leaning towards the estimates for the OLS. But whether they're right or wrong by 300 million or 400 million, I'm sure they're on the upper side. 2 other points. One, that's why we need a large surplus. The governor's proposed 2.2 billion. I think that's a good number because you, in this economy, can't risk any kind of shortfalls. So therefore, a building in a surplus is important to do. So time will tell, but I'm of the belief that their revenue estimates are close to being a lot more accurate than the governor's.
Okay. The governor said his budget includes $1.25 billion in cuts. And in the spring, he said he instructed all departments to slash their budgets by 15% for fiscal year 2021. In his budget address, he said they had delivered on this request. Dale, did they really make those 15% cuts? And what's being cut as part of the $1.25 billion of cuts that are in the proposed budget? So I guess this is a 2-part question. Did they make the 15% cuts for the time that's already transpired? And looking forward, what's in the budget as far as being part of the $1.25 billion that the governor says is in his proposed budget as cuts?
So when the pandemic hit early March, Jeff, and nobody knew what to do and what to expect, the governor had essentially, I don't know what the right word, Rich, suspended or held fiscal $20 that had been approved, but he basically said, we're going to suspend these dollars and not expend them at this time. Again,
Correct.
not knowing what the pandemic was going to mean. I think what he did in that memo that you cited in terms of 15% cut, they took those dollars that were already suspended and had not been used March, April, May, and lopped that on to the 15%. So, is obviously we looked at all those suspensions for various client interests, and it was, there were just many line items that, as Rich, I'm sure, has helped, I don't want to say buried dollars in line items over the years as budget director, but he knows how some of those accounts work, and they're not all spent entirely. So it probably wasn't that difficult to get to 15%, especially since they had already suspended dollars back at the end of March, early April.
Let me just add another, I don't disagree with any of that, because the state did de-appropriate the money. Very unusual action. And some of those cuts came forward, but I looked quickly at them, and here's some big reductions that I noticed. There's $330 million reduction in the Medicaid program. And I know that is because the federal government has increased its reimbursement rate for Medicaid costs. So instead of the state paying 50% of the cost, they're now only going to have to pay 41% of the cost, or some such number. So they were able to reduce the state's contribution for the Medicaid program. They didn't injure the Medicaid program. I think that would be a very big mistake. So, but from a budget point of view, they were able to cut state funding for Medicaid, about $330 million, not a small number. They cut the transit subsidy by $70 million. The reason? Because the federal government dropped a bunch of money into transportation. I can go back to the federal discussion a little bit later if you wish. Higher education was reduced by $210 million, not a small number. And I'm sure the colleges are not going to be happy with that. And the county colleges were also specifically itemized. And there were a couple of things like housing reductions where they just switched the spending to a trust fund that was dedicated for something else that it could be rededicated. So there was a lot of kinds of things that Dale spoke about, kinds of things that I alluded to at the end there, but there were some real cuts. But most of the cuts were made up by the federal dollars coming in. I think the big entity that was affected, quite frankly, is the higher education industry. So let me stop there.
Thanks. Rich, Dale, other than pension and benefits reform, and perhaps the surplus, is there anything else significant you think can be cut? In other words, to me, those seem like the big dollar spending items. And I'm just wondering, are there any other large spending items that can realistically be cut? So Rich, let's start with you.
I think in my opening comments, I suggested as part of balancing the budget that the pension contributions be reduced. The line item is about $4.6 billion. And I suggested $1 to $2 billion. Is it the right thing to do? Well, no. Is it a desperate thing to do? Perhaps, but is it a necessary thing to do to cover this shortfall? So that's a place to start. Perhaps defer some of the salary increases that employees are scheduled to get would be another one. The baby bonds, I mean, good Lord, why are we putting $40 billion into the budget for that when we have more desperate needs than to worry about a program that probably should be funded by the federal government if we're going to do it, not by the state government? On that same point, I want to remind people that may disagree with this thesis that 75% of the state budget is state aid to municipalities, counties, and school districts, or to grants dominated by higher education and the Medicaid program and a large number of community programs. So 75% of that money is difficult, I would argue, to cut. Another 5% is debt service and capital. You got to pay the debt service, and capital is critical for this state. So that leaves the budget, if you will, with only 20% of operating costs. So some people say, well, anybody can cut 20%. I want to remind folks also that the number of employees have been reduced by 16,000 over the last 11 years. And the majority of state employees are institutional care workers, correction institutions, mental hospitals, centers for the veterans, centers for the developmentally disabled, case workers, state police. So I'm not trying to defend the bureaucracy per se. I'm just trying to suggest to the listener that cuts beyond 1 or 2% really get into, all right, so we're going to have property taxes go up if we don't provide school aid. We're going to have a lot more sick people if we don't fund the Medicaid program. And of course, it depends where you sit on this axis. But that's my 2 cents.
Dale, do you see any big items other than the surplus and the pension payments that could at least theoretically be cut?
Not really, Jeff. I mean, I think Rich summed it up very well. I mean, pension has really always been the hot potato. Previous governors have gotten us in the situation we've been in, and it's been a bipartisan problem. I think Christie and Murphy have tried for different reasons, but have tried to put more into the pension. But, you know, this is a pandemic. This is a once in a lifetime thing, and you know, takes extraordinary measures and restraint at times, and not putting the money that the governor has proposed into the pension program would be a significant thing and keep us hopefully away from having to bond to the amount that they've talked about.
You know, I just want to briefly throw in there something that, Rich, you said either in our last budget discussion this year or the previous one in, I guess that would be 2019. And that is, I believe the governor is always saying that he's trying to get to the actuarially suggested recommended payment of, I forget if it's 70 or 80% of, you know, what should be put in that year. And so I had asked you at the time, well, once 2023 comes around and we've reached that mark, well, then is the problem gone? And you said, no, we still would have, you know, 7-8 billion at that point that we have to put into pensions and health benefits, which would make it even more. So we don't have to discuss it, but I just wanted to make people aware that it's not like this problem is going to be over if we put in the money that the governor is requesting for the next 3 years. We would still have very high payments, you know, until there's pension and health benefits reform.
Correct. Just a quick comment.
Sure.
Funding required this year would be about $6.5 billion if we went by what the actuary said. The governor recommended about 4.6. And so therefore, if you underfund it, the problem grows some more.
Right.
And my suggestion to underfund it more will make the problem grow larger. But I would argue it's better than issuing debt. Senator Sweeney said, yes, let's change the pension system. We need to change it. We can't keep funding the way it is. And his proposal would be, we don't want to get into that perhaps today or maybe later, but that would address some of the long-term problems, albeit not the short-term problems.
So Rich, just a minute or two ago, mentioned the baby bond program. At the same time that the governor is trying to fill the budget hole, he has proposed the baby bond program, which will cost about $80 million annually. Dale, can you just briefly tell us what this baby bond program would do and whether you think it's a good idea?
Well, this is a play on what Senator Booker of New Jersey had proposed, I think when he was running for reelection, or I'm sorry, I think he had proposed a year or two ago. He may have even introduced a bill at the federal level, but it hasn't gone anywhere. So, I mean, this is clearly we haven't really talked about the politics of the budget generally, but when you look at the baby bond proposal, the cigarette tax proposal, the increase on gun owners, and then you lay over which is not directly the governor's fault. This is something that was done before, but an increase in the gas tax as of October 1st of some number. There's a lot of politics in this budget at this lower level that have a disparate impact on people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. So the baby bond proposal, is intended to give somebody $1,000 upon the birth, and would not have access to it until they reach the age of 18. And there would, I guess, be certain restrictions on, how that money could be used by that individual. I think most of and this is a Republican and Democrat response. This is not just one party or the other, but they see it as kind of tokenism. It's like,
Right.
We understand the philosophy of it, but what is, I don't know, do the math on what $1,000 would be worth in 18 years. But, what's that really going to do for somebody? And it's like some of these tax credit programs are kind of open-ended. You get a big baby boom year and it's more money. But so I don't know. The initial reaction has been, social engineering. This goes very much to the governor's progressive base of something to do. And he's running for re-election, which we haven't mentioned in this conversation. He's running for re-election next year. So the folks, everybody would benefit. I think you had to be below a certain income level, I believe.
Yeah, it's a pretty high number though. I think it's like 140,000 a year.
Yeah.
It was six figures for sure. But even then, that might have some constitutional issues if you're going to say that it's not all babies that are born.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's complicated.
Yeah, and you mentioned the bipartisan hesitation on this program. I believe just yesterday I read that maybe this morning Senator Weinberg, who's very progressive, herself said that she thinks this is, isn't going to do anything, so on and so forth. And if she's got problems with it, other Democrats certainly will.
If I had to sum up the refrain from most people, now's not the time to be talking about it.
Yeah,
I would agree with that 100%. Not now.
So, wait a second. I have a question here from one of our members, and I'm sure this is something we could probably talk about forever. But let's handle it quickly. This is the question: is there any sort of historical evidence to suggest that millionaires would leave New Jersey due to an increase in tax? Now, I've personally seen answers to that question widely varying. I know the New Jersey Business and Industry says, yeah, people are leaving. And then some of the progressive groups, I think the New Jersey Policy Perspective or something like that, says, nah, people don't really leave because of this. Dale, I'm sure you're familiar with all these debates, and Rich, probably you too. Is there any evidence that this is really true, that people are leaving because of high taxes?
I mean, I'm gonna let the thing that I'm most familiar with, and I don't know how anecdotal it is, but what's the large moving company, Van Lines or United Van Lines? They do an annual out-migration, in-migration for all states, and New Jersey always seems to be, kind of leading the pack of out-migration. At the same time, we're getting people coming into the state, but I'm not sure that they're replacing the same income level of folks
Right.
that are in the state.
Right. Rich, do you have any thoughts on that?
I got a couple observations. I headed up a policy institute at Princeton for 3 or 4 years, and we actually did a study on this issue, looking at federal and state tax returns. And the conclusion was we were getting more people moving into the state. Having said that, I've seen studies that said the reverse, that there are people leaving the state, and we can certainly point to 1 or 2 big dramatic ones where somebody left because the taxes were too high. And that I also observed that the housing industry in New Jersey is booming because of people moving into northern New Jersey, leaving from New York City. So we're probably picking up some millionaires there too. So it's not a simple answer to the question. And those people who do not like taxes, who make a lot of money, will say, we're going to leave.
Yeah.
I don't know. If you're looking for money, you look there.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. This may be a little too technical here, but if the millionaire's tax passes, do you favor the division of taxation that they would begin to do residency audits as New York does? And I guess, Rich, that's more likely to be something you would know about, or is that too technical even for you?
Well, let me make it, in fact, in the article I refer to, I suggested this, that New Jersey residents who work in New York pay New York taxes first before they pay New Jersey taxes. And we pay $4 billion of New Jersey residents to New York. We now have the phenomenon that a lot of those folks are no longer working in New Jersey, they're working from home.
Oh,
so there's a tax issue that says, can we not tax those folks in New Jersey? And I don't know the answer to that. People tell me, yes, you can. Well, their lawyers tell me, no, you can't. So somebody should review it, because I think that's going to be a continuing issue of people working from home who live in New Jersey, whose job is in New York. And we ought to figure out how to get at those folks.
Right.
Now, to that person's specific question, I don't know whether I can add anything to it.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's move on to the bonding proposal. In our survey, 63% of the respondents were opposed to the proposed $1 billion in bonding. Dale, do you think this bonding will be approved by the legislature at $4 billion? And if not that, what number do you think they'll come to?
Listen, I think the OLS comments yesterday and today have really raised the question about how much we need to bond. I think there will be some number, but I don't believe it's going to be 4. And as I mentioned earlier, the Senate Budget Chairman, Paul Sarlo, issued a statement yesterday that OLS and the Treasurer's Office have to speak. In fact, one of the OLS, former OLS senior staffer, is now working in the Murphy administration as the deputy treasurer. So she's very well aware of, how OLS gets its numbers, and it would be very easy for them to agree on some number. So bottom line, Jeff, yes, I think that they will bond despite Professor Keevey's best advice. The question is how much, but it's not going to be what it is now. I'm going to bet it's going to be closer to $2 billion.
Okay, I may have alluded to this before. No, actually I didn't. I just heard this morning, or maybe I did, that United States Senate President Mitch McConnell will probably be posting a stimulus package shortly for posting it for a vote. What happens if that passes and New Jersey gets a few billion in federal aid? How does that impact the budget? Can the governor just spend it as he sees fit, or does it have to go to, right away to paying off the bonds? And I haven't heard this addressed. Does anybody know what the answer to that is?
Well, depends how the federal law is written. For example, some of the money that the state has been getting so far has been designated in certain areas: transportation, education, Medicaid. I think at least the proposal from the House Democrats was broader, that you can use it for anything you wish. So let's say that that's what happened. And then the state could take that money and just use it as a revenue item, and therefore would not need to either A, issue bonds, or B, raise taxes less than that. So it's a real fine issue at the moment. It could be really critical, and it's important that the U.S. Congress decides pretty soon, because there's lots of states, just like New Jersey, who are in trouble. And if the federal government, let's say the federal government allocates a whole bunch of money, we would probably get something like 3 or 4% of the total. That could drop right into the budget and solve the problem. However, what do you do the next year? But it's certainly better than bonding. So let's hope they move on it.
But what happens if it passes in, I mean, the money comes in after the budget has already been approved? It comes in, let's say December, and let's just say $2 billion. Does that have to be applied to, well, let me put it this way. Is the governor and the legislature stuck at the $40 billion budget or whatever they pass? Or could they say, hey, look, here's another $2 billion. Let's go and start these new programs?
Well, theoretically, yes, they could start new programs or fund things. My suggestion to them would be, for example, do not issue your bond. Let's say Dale is absolutely right, and I think he probably is. They're going to approve issuing of bonds. For what number, I do not know. Do not issue them on day one, and therefore put it in the budget as a revenue item, that's what they want to do. But let's say they put $3 billion, or using Dale's example, let's say they put $2 billion as a revenue item in there to balance the budget and move forward. They don't have to sell the debt right away. They don't need the cash right away, perhaps. I don't know their cash position offhand. And therefore, if federal money becomes available, they don't have to issue the bonds, and they'll use the federal revenue instead of the bond money.
Right.
Well, that's a lot of ifs. That's a lot.
That's a lot of contingencies.
So, and let me just add if I can. I mean, Rich is absolutely correct. Keep in mind, you have that 4-person legislative panel that has to approve the use of the funds from the bond issue. So that's also a stopgap if for some reason the money comes in afterwards. And let's just say they went to market and they issued the debt, but they could still hold it up, based on that legislative panel.
Okay. Question from one of our members, and I think I can answer this one. Why wasn't the bond issue put up to a public vote per the New Jersey Constitution? And that usually is what happened. And that did not happen because of a provision in the Constitution, New Jersey Constitution, that basically allows in emergency situations, crises, to do the bonding without having to go for a public vote. So I think that answers that question. Now,
let me just say a little bit. The Supreme Court ruled on that issue.
Right. So that was upheld. This was not a illegal, gimmicky, underhanded trick. It's there in the Constitution. So I'd like to ask a few quick questions about the $2.2 billion surplus. I heard a lobbyist from the New Jersey Business and Industry Association say, you don't put money into a rainy day fund when it's pouring out. Now, I love that quote, and I was really tempted to pretend that I came up with it myself, but honesty got the better of me. An implication in what she said is that there wouldn't be a need for large tax hikes if the surplus was smaller. Rich, what do you think?
Well, 2 points. First of all, she's wrong. It's not in a rainy day fund. That's a whole separate issue and a whole separate dedication. This is regular fund balance surplus. And given the inability or the difficulty to estimate revenues in this climate and this environment, it's important to have a revenue, to have a surplus, a regular surplus. $2 billion is a small number out of a $40 billion. It's probably higher than the states had for the last few years, but I would hesitate dramatically to change that number. Maybe a little bit, maybe a couple $100 million, but the surplus is a reputable, a good number. So that person, when it rains, it pours, is a offhand observation that I would say not good fiscal policy.
So you don't think I should use that term as much as I like it? Okay.
Not within this context.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
Can I just
Sure.
comment? There's the political side to that, right? I mean, listen, I agree with Rich on his assessment. I mean, he's the numbers guy, and it's important. Surplus, budget, fund balances, and surpluses are important. But it's difficult to the person on the outside to understand how you could be raising all these taxes, bonding all of these, potentially going to debt for billions of dollars, and then wanting to keep some of it in reserve. So you're going to pay debt to hold on to some money. To the untrained observer, it's a very difficult thing to understand. So a quote like that gets a lot of play because it has a visceral, yeah, that makes sense to me. Why are we doing this? So it's
Right.
the politics of it that drive this. And 2.2 billion sounds like a lot of money to be sitting in a bank account somewhere.
Okay. Well, you guys have convinced me. I'm not going to use that quote again. Let's wrap up our discussion by talking about the $4.9 billion pension fund payment that's in the governor's budget proposal. So we have in New Jersey an unfunded pension and health benefits liability somewhere, depending on who you talk to, between 150 and $200 billion. I believe that when it comes to this sort of thing, we are worst or second worst in the nation. Not surprisingly, the biggest nut in the state budget is always public employee pension and benefits. In this proposed budget, spending on pension and benefits is about $7.7 billion combined, which is about 24% of the budget. Unfortunately, I personally think the governor will never, not in this term and not in his next term, make any significant reforms to these programs to bring down the cost. I just think he's too close to the unions, his most powerful supporters, and that he's ideologically committed to their cause. Dale, what do you think? I would actually love to hear that I'm wrong.
Again, I'm gonna overlay the politics of it, and that's at a time unprecedented. We're putting more money into the pension, and there have been no layoffs. When people in the private sector, many industries have been ripped apart. I can think of the restaurant and hospitality industry where folks have lost their jobs, and nobody in state government has lost their job. They've been furloughed, but they haven't lost their jobs. And I think there's a sense, again, from a macro political sense, that if you're a public employee, why haven't you shared some of the pain that we've shared, those of us that are on the unemployment line? So if it's a reduction in the amount of pension that one wants to pay, put in, then that would make sense. So I support Rich's thought about either suspending or reducing the amount of the pension payment this year. And I think it's good politics as well, again, to show that state employees are participating in a very difficult time.
One last question before we have to close. Getting back to what you said, Dale, but do you ever think the governor will actually ever support pension and health benefits reform? I mean, I know that it's something that needs to be done. You do, Rich does, but From a political perspective, my personal sense, and I've been wrong before, is that this governor will probably never, ever support that. And without his support, reform will never happen.
I think there are a bunch of decision points in this budget that I think that the governor would ultimately accept a reduction in the pension commitment this year. So I don't think that's sacrosanct to him that he's got to get that number. There are just too many moving parts here. I think getting the surplus is important to him. I think getting the some level of bonding is important to him. And I think if he got possibly a millionaire's tax, that would also supersede the pension commitment that was in this year's budget.
But what about looking long-term past this budget year coming up, as far as structural reforms that the path to progress was calling for? That would make this a less expensive item going every year going forward. Do you think the governor would ever support that significant reforms?
Unless the public employee unions are going to be supportive, I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. That was my sense. Well, I'm glad to hear at least I got that right. Well, Rich and Dale, as usual, our time together discussing this budget, proposed budget, has gone by very quickly, though we could have spent another hour or an hour and a half, and I've had to skip a lot of the questions that I really wanted to ask. Well, we've come to the end of the program, and thank you both so much for joining us today. I have found, as usual, your comments and insights very educational and very interesting, and I'm sure our members have as well. So thank you, both of you, for coming.
You're quite welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Remember, if you have a colleague who missed today's broadcast, we will be replaying it twice for CPE credit, September 14th at noon and September 17th at 6 p.m. You can learn more about the budget and follow the developments at njcpa.org/njbudget. And our next edition of Issues Watch Live will be a professional issues update on September 30th at noon, which replays on October 5th and 7th. I also encourage you to listen and subscribe to our Issues Watch podcast, hosted by your favorite host, which is me. Every other Tuesday, I provide updates on happenings in Trenton and interview State House insiders, policy experts, and leaders in the business community. Listen in on your favorite podcast app or follow the link on your screen. And thanks everybody for watching.